Welcome to my YouTube channel, VitaBite. The scale is dropping. You feel lighter. You assume everything is working. But what if the weight you are losing is the one thing your body cannot afford to lose? What if every pound disappearing is not fat, but the very tissue keeping your metabolism alive, your joints stable, your blood sugar controlled, and your body protected from disease? This is not a rare edge case. It is happening to millions of people right now, and most of them have absolutely no idea. Today, we are going to change that. Here is what most people get completely wrong about weight loss. When the number on the scale falls, they celebrate. They push harder, fast longer, eat less, convinced they are making progress. But very often, what is actually leaving the body is muscle, not fat. And that distinction matters more for your long-term health than almost anything else you could know. Muscle is not simply about strength or how you look in the mirror. Muscle is your metabolic engine. It is where glucose gets stored safely. It is where insulin sensitivity lives. It is the biological shield protecting you from type 2 diabetes, physical frailty, dangerous falls, and even cognitive decline. When muscle disappears, your metabolism slows, insulin resistance worsens, and the visceral fat you are trying to eliminate becomes harder, not easier to shift. Here is the real tragedy. Many people lose muscle while genuinely believing they are doing everything right. They fast diligently, reduce their calories, increase their exercise, but they completely overlook the mechanism that determines whether the body burns fat or sacrifices muscle instead. That mechanism is hormonal, not caloric. The body does not randomly select muscle as fuel. Muscle breakdown happens when the body perceives stress without any sense of safety. Chronically elevated cortisol, inadequate protein signaling, poor recovery, disrupted sleep, sustained undereating, and endless cardio performed without any resistance training. These are the biological signals that tell your body it is in danger. And a body that perceives danger responds by preserving energy and breaking down what it considers expensive tissue. Muscle is the most expensive tissue you have. One of the most misunderstood ideas in the health space is the relationship between fasting and muscle loss. Fasting itself does not destroy muscle when approached correctly. In fact, proper fasting raises growth hormone, the very hormone that protects lean tissue and drives the body toward burning fat as its primary fuel. But fasting layered on top of poor sleep, chronic stress, excessive exercise, and nutritional deficiencies creates an entirely different hormonal reality. In that environment, cortisol dominates, and cortisol is the real villain in this story. It is a survival hormone that breaks muscle down into amino acids so the liver can manufacture glucose. That response is genuinely useful in a short-term emergency. But when cortisol stays elevated day after day, driven by sleeplessness, overtraining, food fear, or prolonged calorie restriction, the body begins to consume its own muscle in a slow, steady, destructive process. Another deeply embedded mistake is the assumption that weight loss automatically equals improved health. Someone loses 20 pounds, and their waist barely changes. Their strength fades. They feel persistently cold. They feel physically weaker. Their resting heart rate climbs. These are not the signs of successful fat loss. These are warning signals of lean tissue loss. Genuine fat loss improves energy, warmth, insulin sensitivity, and functional strength. Muscle loss does the exact opposite. And here is something that almost nobody mentions. Visceral fat actively thrives in a low muscle environment. Muscle functions as a glucose sink. It pulls sugar out of the bloodstream and stores it safely. When muscle mass shrinks, glucose has fewer places to go. Insulin rises in compensation, and fat, particularly the dangerous visceral variety, gets stored far more aggressively. This is precisely why people who lose muscle often regain fat rapidly, even while eating less than before. Now let us look at the actual warning signs your body sends when it is losing muscle rather than fat, because these signals are real, they are specific, and if you know what to look for, you can catch the problem before it becomes serious metabolic damage. One of the earliest and strangest indicators is getting physically weaker while simultaneously getting lighter. People describe it this way: the scale is going down, but carrying groceries feels harder, climbing stairs requires more effort, and getting up from the floor takes noticeably more energy than it used to. That should immediately raise a flag. Fat loss does not make you weaker. Muscle loss does. Strength is directly tied to muscle fiber quality and the integrity of nerve signaling. When muscle fibers break down faster than they are rebuilt, strength declines quickly, often well before any visible wasting becomes apparent. This pattern typically emerges when someone combines aggressive fasting or severe calorie restriction with high stress levels and no resistance training whatsoever. The body reaches a simple, brutal conclusion. We need energy immediately, and muscle will provide it. A second subtle warning sign is feeling colder than usual, particularly in the hands and feet, and even in environments where other people are perfectly comfortable. Muscle is metabolically active tissue. It generates heat as a natural byproduct of its constant activity. When muscle mass declines, resting energy expenditure drops, circulation deteriorates, and people begin layering on extra clothing indoors while everyone around them feels fine. That persistent chill is not a sign of fat burning. It is a marker of metabolic slowdown driven by lean tissue loss. A third signal is poor and prolonged recovery from exercise. You work out, but instead of feeling energized and capable the following day, you remain sore for several days afterward. Workouts that should feel manageable feel disproportionately draining. This pattern tells us that protein signaling, growth hormone activity, and the sleep-driven repair cycle are all functioning below par. The body is struggling to rebuild tissue after exertion, and muscle is reliably the first thing to be compromised in that scenario. This brings us back to fasting, because this is genuinely where the most confusion exists. Proper fasting lowers insulin and elevates growth hormone. Growth hormone protects muscle and directs the body toward fat as its preferred fuel. But when fasting is stacked on top of insufficient sleep, inadequate protein intake, and unmanaged chronic stress, the entire hormonal environment flips. Growth hormone cannot perform its protective role when cortisol is dominating the system. Cortisol breaks muscle down. Growth hormone preserves it. Insulin blocks fat burning. The balance among these three hormones, not the calorie count, determines what tissue you actually lose. Another frequently overlooked sign is a slightly slimmer waistline with no corresponding improvement in metabolic markers. People notice their trousers fitting a little more loosely, but their blood sugar remains elevated, triglycerides have not improved, and their energy is no better than before. That is not healthy visceral fat loss. True reduction of deep abdominal fat produces rapid, measurable improvements in laboratory values. Muscle loss can create superficial cosmetic changes while delivering zero metabolic benefit. There is also the specific pattern of appetite disappearing alongside increasing fatigue and mental fog. When fasting is functioning correctly, hunger arrives in waves and then subsides naturally, and mental clarity improves as the brain shifts to ketone fuel. When muscle loss is actively occurring, appetite often vanishes, but rather than clarity arriving in its place, fatigue and cognitive heaviness intensify. That combination is not the sign of successful ketosis. It is the signature of stress physiology taking hold. Sleep disruption is another sign that muscle loss is occurring beneath the surface, and it presents in a very particular way. People wake between 3 and 4 in the morning with a racing mind or a low-level sense of anxiety they cannot explain. That is cortisol. The body is breaking down amino acids from muscle tissue in order to stabilize blood sugar during the overnight fast. This pattern is especially common in people who fast too frequently, fast for too long, or attempt extended fasting without adequate recovery time or sufficient protein intake during their eating window. One group deserves specific attention here: adults over 40. After this age, a process called anabolic resistance sets in. The rate at which muscle protein synthesis responds to stimulation becomes progressively less efficient. This does not mean building or preserving muscle becomes impossible. It means the approach must become more deliberate and more intentional than it was in younger years. Random fasting, combined with chronic calorie deficits and extended cardio sessions without any resistance component, is not a weight loss strategy at this life stage. It is a reliable pathway towards sarcopenia, the progressive and debilitating loss of muscle mass that accelerates aging and dramatically reduces quality of life. Now let us address diet directly, because this is where many well-meaning people unknowingly undermine themselves. It is not only about the duration of a fast, it is about what you eat when the fast ends. Muscle is preserved by signals, not simply by calorie quantities. If the right signals are absent, the body that will sacrifice muscle even when fat remains readily available. The most critical signal for lean tissue preservation is adequate protein paired with controlled insulin responses. Protein is not merely a building block for muscle, it is a biological message. When amino acids, particularly leucine, reach muscle cells, they activate the repair and synthesis pathways that maintain lean tissue. But if protein intake is insufficient, or if its signal is diluted by sugar and refined carbohydrates arriving simultaneously, that message never reaches its destination. The mistake that appears repeatedly is this: people break a fast with fruit, smoothies, toast, or breakfast cereal. They believe they are being nutritionally gentle with their body after a period of not eating. What they are actually doing is spiking insulin sharply without providing the amino acids that muscle repair requires. Insulin shuts down fat burning. Without protein, muscle cannot repair itself. Over time, the body adapts to this repeated pattern by gradually reducing muscle mass to match the available repair signals. Chronically low protein intake is another major contributor, particularly among people following plant-based eating patterns that depend heavily on grains and starches. There is nothing inherently wrong with plant foods, but many vegetarian and vegan dietary approaches are meaningfully protein deficient unless they are carefully and deliberately planned. Muscle tissue does not respond to nutritional philosophy, it responds to amino acid availability. Without adequate amino acids arriving regularly, muscle maintenance is simply not possible regardless of how clean the rest of the diet appears. Stress layers directly onto this picture because stress is the silent accelerant of muscle loss. When cortisol is elevated, the body converts protein, sourced primarily from muscle, into glucose through a process called gluconeogenesis. This is not a theoretical concern, it is fundamental survival biology. When blood sugar drops and insulin is low, cortisol steps in to protect the brain's fuel supply. Muscle pays the price. This is exactly why people who fast aggressively while sleeping poorly, over-exercising relentlessly, and living under sustained psychological pressure lose muscle at an accelerated rate. They often ask, "But I am fasting, shouldn't growth hormone be protecting me?" Growth hormone only performs its protective function in a low-stress hormonal environment. When cortisol is dominant, growth hormone is effectively overridden. Joint instability and unexplained aches represent another strange but telling indicator that muscle loss is underway. Muscles stabilize joints. When they weaken, the load transfers to ligaments and the joints themselves, which were not designed to bear that burden alone. People attribute this to aging or inflammation, but frequently it is the consequence of declining muscular support. Knees feel unstable on stairs, shoulders click and catch. Lower back discomfort appears without any obvious injury. These are not the signs of successful fat reduction. They are the signals of structural compromise from lean tissue loss. Let us also address the specific issue of cardio obsession, because it is far more common than most people realize. Long, steady-state cardio performed daily, especially in a fasted state, can meaningfully accelerate muscle loss when it is not balanced with resistance training. The body becomes increasingly efficient at burning fuel during sustained aerobic activity, but it simultaneously becomes efficient at shedding tissue it no longer perceives as necessary. If muscles are not being challenged and given a clear physiological reason to remain, they will not remain. Resistance training sends an unmistakable biological signal. This tissue is essential and must be maintained. Even light resistance work, performed consistently, dramatically shifts the outcome of fasting from muscle wasting to muscle preservation. You do not need to become a competitive athlete. You simply need to give your muscles a compelling biological reason to exist. Here is a point that genuinely surprises most people. Eating too frequently can also contribute to muscle loss over time. Constant insulin elevation prevents fat from being accessed as fuel, forces the body into continuous glucose dependence, and leads progressively to insulin resistance. Once insulin resistance becomes established, muscle cells stop responding appropriately to the anabolic signals that would normally trigger repair and maintenance. They become metabolically compromised and eventually begin to shrink. Healthy muscle thrives in a low insulin, high nutrient, low stress biological environment. Constant eating disrupts all three of those conditions simultaneously. Now let us establish clearly how to distinguish between fat loss and muscle loss, because your body communicates the difference through specific, readable signals if you know what to look for. The problem is that most people are monitoring only the scale. The scale is completely indifferent to what you are losing. Your body is not. When fat is being lost correctly, energy improves in a sustained, stable way. You wake up with more clarity. You feel physically lighter yet more capable than before. Your endurance and stamina improve even as your weight decreases. Fat loss makes the body more metabolically efficient. Muscle loss makes it fragile and unreliable. One of the most dependable markers available is waist reduction, occurring alongside preserved or improving strength. True visceral fat loss shrinks the waist, while physical strength stays the same or increases. If the waist is narrowing but strength, posture, and balance are all declining simultaneously, the loss is coming from muscle, not fat. Additionally, genuine visceral fat reduction improves blood pressure, triglycerides, blood sugar markers, and fatty liver indicators relatively quickly. Muscle loss produces none of these metabolic benefits, regardless of what the tape measure shows. Exercise response is another reliable clue. When fat is being burned appropriately, moderate physical activity feels progressively easier over time. When muscle is being lost, even mild effort feels disproportionately harder than it should. Recovery takes longer. Heart rate remains elevated well past the point when it should have returned to baseline. These responses tell us that the metabolic engine is being dismantled rather than strengthened and optimized. Laboratory results tell an important part of this story as well, because markers in the blood do not mislead. With healthy fat loss, triglycerides fall, HDL cholesterol rises, fasting insulin drops, and inflammatory markers quiet down. With muscle loss, you often see normal or even low glucose readings alongside persistent fatigue, poor sleep quality, and cortisol-related patterns, including increased abdominal fat accumulation and fragmented sleep architecture. The numbers on the scale may look encouraging, while the internal picture tells a completely different story. Posture is another underappreciated indicator. People who are losing muscle gradually begin to slump forward. Shoulders roll inward. Core stability weakens. Balance declines subtly but measurably. This happens long before dramatic muscle wasting becomes visually obvious, and it is one of the earliest structural signs that lean tissue is being compromised from the inside out. Muscle is what keeps the body upright, stable, and resilient, and its loss announces itself through posture before it announces itself through the mirror. This brings us to a point worth emphasizing with complete clarity. Muscle is not simply tissue for movement. It is a full metabolic organ. It absorbs glucose from the bloodstream, buffers insulin responses, and produces anti-inflammatory signaling molecules that protect the entire body. Losing muscle worsens insulin resistance over time, even if the scale decreases initially. This is the mechanism behind a pattern that many people experience, but few understand. They lose weight, feel briefly encouraged, and then regain more fat than they started with, often in worse locations than before. Fasting, done correctly, prevents exactly this outcome. When insulin drops and growth hormone rises, fat becomes the body's primary fuel source, and muscle is actively protected. The body enters a state of conservation and repair rather than breakdown. This is why people who fast, with genuine intelligence, respecting the physiological conditions that make fasting beneficial, often emerge looking leaner, more defined, and stronger rather than smaller and depleted. The difference between these two outcomes is not the number of fasting hours, it is the hormonal environment in which those hours are. Age adds a layer of urgency to all of this. After 50, muscle loss accelerates meaningfully when resistance training and protein intake are neglected. This is precisely why fasting should never be practiced in isolation at any age, and especially not later in life. Fasting must be paired with deliberate nourishment, purposeful movement, sufficient sleep, and active stress management. Without those paired elements, you are not optimizing your body, you are gradually dismantling its foundation. A common misconception worth addressing directly: being in ketosis does not automatically protect muscle. Ketones are muscle-sparing only under specific conditions, when cortisol is controlled and nutrient intake is adequate. Ketones combined with chronic stress produce breakdown, not repair. The presence of ketones in the bloodstream is not, by itself, a guarantee that muscle is being preserved. The broader hormonal environment determines that outcome. So what does the actual correction look like? It is not eating more frequently, it is not abandoning fasting altogether, it is reintroducing the precise signals the body needs to choose fat over muscle. Protein-dense meals timed strategically after fasting, resistance work performed consistently, even at modest intensity, sleep treated as a non-negotiable biological priority, stress reduced through deliberate practice rather than sheer willpower. These are the inputs that change the output, not dramatic overhauls, but consistent, intelligent signals given to a body that is always listening and always responding. Now let us examine the behavioral and psychological patterns that quietly cause muscle loss, even in people who are convinced they are doing everything correctly. This part of the conversation makes many people uncomfortable, but biology responds to actual behavior, not to intentions, regardless of how sincere those intentions are. The first trap is impatience. When results do not arrive quickly enough, people extend their fasts further, cut calories harder, and train more aggressively, believing that greater suffering produces proportionally greater fat loss. The body does not operate on that logic. When it senses unrelenting pressure with no recovery, it adapts by conserving energy at the expense of expensive tissue. Muscle is metabolically costly to maintain. Fat is cheap to store. Under sustained biological stress, muscle is sacrificed first. The second trap is inconsistency disguised as intensity. Someone fasts for 3 days, then overeats for 2. They train intensely for a week, then crash completely. The body never receives a stable, readable signal. Muscle thrives on consistency and predictable patterns. Sporadic extremes confuse the hormonal rhythms that govern tissue maintenance and actively favor breakdown over repair. Comparison with others is another silent contributor to poor outcomes. People observe someone else performing 72-hour fasts or following extreme protocols and assume they must replicate those methods to achieve results. What they cannot observe is that person's age, accumulated stress, sleep quality, or metabolic baseline. What preserves muscle in one individual can accelerate its loss in another. The body operates according to personal biology, not social media trends. Identity-based dieting creates its own set of problems. People attach firmly to nutritional labels keto, vegan, carnivore, fasting only, and begin ignoring direct feedback from their own body. Muscle loss does not respect dietary philosophy. If recovery is inadequate, protein signaling is insufficient, and mechanical loading is absent, muscle will diminish regardless of which nutritional framework surrounds those deficiencies. Fear of protein deserves direct attention because it is far more widespread than it should be. Many people genuinely believe that consuming protein will spike insulin and interrupt fat burning, so they chronically undereat it. In reality, protein produces a mild insulin response that is both necessary for muscle repair and insufficient to shut down fat burning when carbohydrate intake is low. Without adequate protein, fasting transitions from a therapeutic biological state into a destructive one. Unresolved emotional stress operates as a cortisol-generating machine that undermines every other element of a well-designed plan. Financial pressure, relationship difficulties, and sustained psychological tension keep cortisol elevated continuously. Someone can fast with perfect timing and eat the cleanest food available, but if their nervous system remains in a constant state of activation, muscle breakdown continues uninterrupted. This is the mechanism that explains why two people following an identical protocol produce completely different results. Stress biology overrides nutritional precision. Recovery is not optional rest for people who lack motivation. Recovery is the biological window during which muscle is actually rebuilt. Effort breaks tissue down, rest builds it back. People who feel guilty resting between training sessions frequently train themselves directly into muscle loss, working against their own goals with disciplined consistency. Misreading hunger and fatigue closes this loop. True fat adaptation produces calm, sustained energy. Muscle loss produces exhaustion and emotional flatness. Learning to distinguish between these two very different sensations requires awareness developed over time, not simply more willpower applied to an already stressed system.